The letter arrived at the Double B Ranch on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, tucked between a seed catalog and an overdue invoice from the feed store in Laramie, Wyoming, and Henry Boone almost threw it away without reading it, because he had grown tired of letters that brought nothing but trouble. He was standing on the porch of his ranch house, the one his father had built with raw timber and stubbornness back in 1861, the one that had survived 2 brutal winters and 1 range war and more loneliness than Henry cared to admit. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled at his collar because he kept forgetting to get it cut in town. His hands were rough from years of fence mending and cattle driving, and there was a permanent squint around his gray eyes from too many years staring into a Wyoming sun. He was not, by any measure of the word, a man who spent much time on correspondence, but something about the handwriting stopped him. It was careful and neat, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who had practiced it with intention, not someone who had been born to leisure. He unfolded the letter right there on the porch, standing in the cool April morning with the smell of sage and pine thick in the air, and he read it. The letter was from a woman named Stella Hadley who was writing from Cheyenne. She had heard, through a mutual acquaintance named Mrs. Clara Webb, that the Double B Ranch was in need of a cook and housekeeper. She wrote that she was 26 years old, widowed, experienced in running a household, capable with horses, and willing to work hard for fair wages. She was not asking for charity, she was asking for work. She wrote it plainly and without embellishment, stating her qualifications the way a man might list them, without apology and without flirtation. She said she could start within the month if he was agreeable and that she would appreciate a reply either way. Henry read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully and went inside to find pen and paper. He sat at the rough-hewn desk his father had made and stared at the blank page for a long time. He needed a cook. That much was true. He also needed a housekeeper, since the ranch house had descended into a state that could only be described as survivable rather than livable. He had 3 ranch hands working for him, good men all of them, but none of them knew how to do much more than boil coffee and fry salt pork, and Henry himself was only marginally better. The practical argument for writing back and saying yes was overwhelming. But Henry Boone sat at that desk and thought about something else entirely, something that surprised him with the force of it, something that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. He thought about what it would mean to have a woman in this house again, not just any arrangement, not just an employee who came and went and kept to her side of things. He thought, in a way that embarrassed him slightly even in the privacy of his own home, about what it might mean to have a real partner, someone to talk to in the evenings when the silence of the Wyoming prairie pressed in on all sides like something physical, someone who understood what it meant to work and to build something that was worth building. He was not a romantic man. He had never claimed to be. But he was a lonely one, and loneliness, when it has had enough years to settle into a man's bones, has a way of clarifying what he actually wants from his life. He started writing the reply, stopped, started again. He tried 3 different versions of a practical, professional response confirming that yes, he did need a housekeeper, and yes, the wages were fair, and yes, she could start in May. He threw all 3 of them into the cold fireplace. Then he picked up the pen again and wrote something honest, which was both the easiest and the hardest thing he had done in a long time. He wrote that he had read her letter and that he appreciated its directness. He wrote that yes, the Double B did need someone capable in the kitchen and around the house, and that the wages he could offer were fair by any standard. But then he wrote something that made him pause before he sealed the envelope, wondering if he had lost his mind or simply found it. He wrote that he was not just looking for a housekeeper. He wrote that he was a man who had spent too many years alone on this land, and that if she was open to the idea, he hoped that they might correspond for a while before she came, so that they might know something of each other before she made the journey. He was not proposing anything. He made that clear. He was only asking if she might be willing to write to him as a person rather than an employer, so that when she arrived, if she arrived, they might not be strangers. He sealed the envelope before he could change his mind, saddled his horse, and rode the 12 miles into Laramie to post it himself rather than waiting for the supply run at the end of the week. The ride back was the longest 12 miles of his life. Stella Hadley read Henry Boone's letter in the small, rented room above the laundry on 16th Street in Cheyenne, where she had been living for the past 8 months. The room was clean but bare, with a single window that looked out onto an alley, and on cold nights she could hear the wind finding its way through the gaps in the walls. She had been working at the laundry since arriving in Cheyenne, after a series of events that she did not like to think about too long or too directly, because they still had the power to knock the breath out of her. Her husband, James Hadley, had died of typhoid fever in the autumn of 1880, leaving her with almost nothing. He had been a good man, quiet and steady, and she had cared for him deeply, though she had come to understand in the year since his death that there is a difference between caring for a person and loving them with the kind of love that reshapes you. James had left her a small amount of savings, enough to get her to Cheyenne and to keep her in that small room for a few months while she figured out what came next. What came next turned out to be the laundry, which was honest work and exhausting work and work that was slowly wearing down her hands and her spirit in equal measure. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, with dark eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they had a way of looking at things too directly and too long. She was not a timid woman. She had never been a timid woman, which had been a source of friction in certain social circles and a source of pride in her own estimation. She had written to the Double B Ranch on the suggestion of Clara Webb, who was a friend of a friend, and she had written the letter as honestly as she could because she had no patience for pretense and no energy left for presenting herself as something she was not. She had expected a practical reply, a yes or a no, and possibly a list of duties and a wage offer. She had not expected this. She read the part where Henry Boone said he was not just looking for a housekeeper 3 times. She read the part about him being a man who had spent too many years alone 2 more. She turned the letter over looking for something she might have missed, some indication that this was strange or inappropriate or cause for alarm. She found none of those things. What she found instead was something that felt unexpectedly like recognition. Not romance. Not yet. Just the sense that this man had written something true in a world where people spent a great deal of effort writing things that were not. She sat for a while looking out the window at the alley, where a tabby cat was making its way along the fence with enormous dignity, and she thought about what to do. Then she got out her writing paper and wrote back. She wrote that she appreciated his honesty and that she would be a liar if she pretended it had not surprised her, because it had. She wrote that she was not in the habit of corresponding with strangers, but that she was also not in the habit of being approached so plainly, and she had to admit that it was a relief. She said she was willing to write to him for a time before making any decisions, and that she hoped he understood she was still considering the position as an employee and had not yet formed any other opinions. She also mentioned, because she felt he deserved to know it, that she was not a woman who could be easily charmed or easily led, and that if he was hoping for a biddable correspondent, he had probably written to the wrong person. Then she sealed that letter and walked it to the post office herself, just as he had done, though she did not know that yet. The exchange of letters that followed over the next 6 weeks was something neither of them had fully anticipated. It began cautiously, with both of them writing the way you do when you are aware that someone is reading everything and judging every word. Henry's first few letters were shorter and slightly stiff, as if he had edited out everything interesting in the interest of propriety. Stella's first few were measured and careful, revealing just enough to keep the correspondence alive without revealing anything she was not yet ready to share. But letters, when they are genuine, have a way of loosening people. There is something about writing in the quiet of an evening, with the day's noise faded and nothing to do but be honest on a page, that strips away the performance a person puts on when they are face to face with the world. Henry wrote about the ranch. Not just the practical facts of it, the acreage and the cattle count and the seasonal rhythms, but what it meant to him. He wrote about his father, who had died of a heart ailment 6 years ago, and whom he missed in a way that still caught him off guard sometimes, usually in the morning when he came down to an empty kitchen and remembered that there used to be someone else there. He wrote about the land itself, about the way Wyoming looked in the early morning in spring when the frost was just burning off, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath before something magnificent. He wrote about his 3 ranch hands, men named Caleb, Dutch, and a younger one who went by the name of Tom, who was 19 and had a talent for getting into trouble in town that Henry found more amusing than alarming. Stella wrote about Cheyenne, and about the laundry, and about the particular loneliness of being a woman alone in a western town in 1882, which was a different kind of loneliness than Henry's, she suspected, because it came with a layer of vulnerability that a man did not have to consider in the same way. She wrote about James, briefly and without excessive grief, explaining who he had been and what she had lost without making herself into a tragic figure. She wrote about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had taught her to ride and a mother who had taught her to keep accounts, and about the way she had always felt she was meant to be somewhere larger and more demanding than the small town of her childhood, even when she could not articulate what that larger life might look like. She wrote, in the 4th letter, about what she wanted. Not what she expected, not what she thought was reasonable or likely, but what she actually wanted, which was land she could call her own in some sense, work that meant something, and someone to share the silence with in the evenings without feeling as though the silence was eating her alive. She wrote it and then she almost did not send it, standing by the post office window with the letter in her hand, thinking that she had revealed too much and made herself too easy to read. Then she sent it anyway, because she was too tired of hiding to keep doing it. Henry read that letter on a Friday evening sitting on his porch while the sun went down over the ridge in sheets of orange and pink, and he read it 3 times, and then he sat very still for a long time thinking about a woman he had never met and feeling something he had not felt in so long he barely recognized it. He called it hope, very quietly to himself, in the darkening evening. His reply to that letter was the longest he had sent. He wrote about what he wanted too. He wrote about the Double B and what it meant to him to have built it beyond what his father had started, to have added the south pasture and the new barn and the breeding stock he had spent 3 years cultivating. He wrote about wanting someone to share it with, not someone to hand it to or to take care of, but someone to stand beside him in it and have an equal stake in what it became. He wrote that he was aware he was being presumptuous, and that he had no right to project any of this onto a woman he had not yet met, and that he would completely understand if she read this, and decided that a position as housekeeper at a more conventional establishment was the better option. Then he wrote, very simply, that he hoped she would come. Stella packed her trunk on a Saturday night in late May, 3 weeks after receiving that last letter. She had made the decision gradually, the way a river changes course, not all at once but through a slow accumulation of small movements in a new direction. She had given notice at the laundry. She had settled her account with the landlady, a Mrs. Forrest, who had been surprisingly emotional about it, and pressed a jar of preserved plums into Stella's hands as a farewell gift. She had written to Henry one final time to confirm the date of her arrival, and to tell him that she would be coming on the Wednesday stage from Cheyenne through Laramie, and that she expected him to be on time to collect her, because she had no patience for being left standing in the street with a trunk. He had written back 3 days later to say he would be there, and that he was glad. The stage from Cheyenne was not a comfortable conveyance. It was a Concord coach that had seen better decades, with cracked leather seats and a suspension system that seemed designed to amplify every irregularity in the road rather than to absorb them. Stella sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and watched Wyoming unspool past the window with a feeling she could not entirely name. It was something between terror and excitement, which she had come to understand were not as different as people generally pretended. The other passengers were a cattle buyer from Denver, a minister who fell asleep almost immediately and snored throughout the journey, and a young woman traveling to meet her fiancé in Laramie who was so nervous she talked almost continuously for the first hour, and then fell into an exhausted silence. Stella listened to all of them with half her attention and gave the other half to the landscape, which was unlike anything she had seen in Missouri. It was bigger out here, genuinely bigger, with a scale that made the sky seem like a different sky from the one she had grown up under, as if someone had taken the entire world and stretched it until there was room in it for something epic to happen. She arrived in Laramie at 2:30 in the afternoon, stepping down from the coach with her trunk and her traveling bag and squinting in the bright May sunshine at a main street that smelled of dust and horses and fresh-cut lumber. She stood for a moment looking around, wondering if she had made an enormous mistake, and then she heard someone say her name. He was standing a little to the left of the stage office, holding the reins of a brown horse with a quiet, patient air about him, and he was nothing like the picture she had assembled in her mind over 6 weeks of letters, and one small tintype photograph he had sent along in his third letter. The photograph had shown her a somewhat formal, square-jawed man standing stiffly in what she suspected were his best clothes. The man standing in front of her now was wearing a battered hat and worn leather gloves and a faded work shirt, and there was a line of tension around his mouth that suggested he was significantly more nervous than he was letting on, and she found that both endearing and recognizable because she was significantly more nervous than she was letting on too. "Miss Hadley," he said, which came out slightly gruffer than he had intended. "Mr. Boone," she said, which came out slightly cooler than she had intended. They looked at each other for a moment in the bright Laramie afternoon, and then something shifted, very slightly, like a lock turning, and Henry Boone smiled at her, a real smile that rearranged his whole face and made him look younger and considerably less like a man who had spent 31 years being practical. "I have a wagon for the trunk," he said. "The ride out to the ranch is about 2 hours. I can stop in town for anything you need before we head out." "I am fine," she said. "Let us go." He loaded her trunk with an efficiency that suggested he had been thinking about this moment and had decided in advance to be useful rather than awkward, and Stella appreciated that more than she expected to. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, and he climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Laramie into the big Wyoming afternoon, and for the first several minutes neither of them said anything. It was Stella who broke the silence, which surprised neither of them. "The land is larger than I expected," she said, looking out at the grass-covered hills rolling away to either side of the road. "It takes some getting used to," Henry said. "I grew up here and there are still mornings when I look out at it and feel small." "Is that a bad feeling?" He considered that for a moment, which she noticed. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which was a quality she respected. "No," he said. "I think it is an honest one." She nodded, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased without her permission, and she thought that perhaps she had not made an enormous mistake after all. The Double B Ranch came into view as they rounded a long curve in the road, and Stella's first impression was of a place that was fundamentally serious. There was nothing decorative about it. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of timber and stone with a wide porch running across the front, and there were several outbuildings, a barn that was newer than everything else, a bunkhouse, and various sheds and corrals. There were horses in the near pasture, good-looking ones, and the whole property had the air of a place that worked for its existence and was not ashamed of it. She liked it immediately, which she had not been certain she would. The 3 ranch hands were gathered at the corral fence as the wagon came in, and Henry made the introductions with a kind of deliberate casualness that told her he had probably warned them to behave themselves. Caleb was the oldest, maybe 40, with a weathered face and a nod that managed to be both respectful and evaluating. Dutch was stocky and quiet and shook her hand with the solemnity of a business transaction. Tom, the 19-year-old, was visibly attempting to seem older and more distinguished than he was, and nearly succeeding. "Ma'am," Tom said, and removed his hat with such vigor that it nearly flew off entirely. "Tom," Henry said, in a tone that communicated quite a lot without raising his voice. "Sir," Tom said and stepped back. Henry showed Stella through the house himself, carrying her traveling bag and not quite meeting her eyes while he narrated each room's function and history in a voice that was trying to be tour guide neutral and was not entirely succeeding. The kitchen was large and practical, with a good iron stove and plenty of work surface, and she could see at once that it had been recently cleaned to within an inch of its life, which meant he had made an effort, which meant something. The main room had a stone fireplace, 2 good chairs, a reading table with a lamp, and shelves with a collection of books that surprised her. She paused to look at them. There were agricultural manuals and ranch guides as expected, but also novels, Dickens and Twain, and a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and a collection of poetry that made her look at him sideways. "Tennyson," she said. He cleared his throat. "My mother's." "Did you read them?" A pause. "Yes." She said nothing else about it and moved on to look at the rest of the house, but she filed that away and held it there. The room she would have was upstairs, at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over the south pasture. It was a decent-sized room with a proper bed and a dresser and a small writing desk under the window, and she thought that whoever had arranged it had thought about what a woman might want, which was more than she had expected. "This will do fine," she said, and Henry Boone looked so relieved that she had to look away so she would not laugh. The first week was an exercise in careful navigation. Stella took over the kitchen with the competent authority of someone who had done this all her life, which she essentially had, and within 3 days the ranch house smelled like something other than dust and saddle leather for the first time in what she suspected was years. She cooked simply but well, biscuits and roasted game birds and a vegetable stew that made Dutch, who was not an expressive man, close his eyes briefly in what appeared to be gratitude. She established her rhythms in the house, found where things were kept, and where they should have been kept and weren't, and made changes quietly and without making an announcement about them. Henry was careful with her that first week in a way that she found both considerate and slightly maddening. He was polite and helpful and kept a distance that was appropriate but felt, at times, excessive, as if he were concerned about doing something wrong and had decided the safest approach was to do as little as possible. He ate the meals she cooked with genuine appreciation, helped with heavy lifting without being asked, and disappeared back to the ranch work afterward with the efficiency of a man who had decided that giving her space was the correct thing to do. She did not want quite so much space. On the 6th evening, she put 2 cups of coffee on the table after dinner and sat down with her own, and when he came in from checking on a horse that had been favoring one foreleg, she simply looked at him until he sat down too. They talked that night for 3 hours. It was the first real conversation they had been able to have, and it was better than the letters had been, because you could watch a person's face when they spoke, and know whether the words were going where the letters had only suggested they might. They talked about the ranch, its finances and its problems and its prospects, and Henry was direct with her about all of it, which she respected. The cattle operation was solid, but he wanted to expand into horse breeding, a plan he had been nurturing for 2 years and was just beginning to put into practice. There were complications with a neighboring rancher, a man named Garrett, who had disputed the fence line along the eastern boundary for the past year in a low-level, aggravating way that had not yet escalated to anything serious, but existed as a constant source of friction. Stella listened and asked practical questions, and offered a few observations that Henry received with the slightly surprised air of a man who had not expected to be offered anything but agreeable listening, and was unexpectedly pleased to get something more. Then they stopped talking about the ranch, and the conversation moved sideways into other things, into memories and opinions and the books on the shelf that turned out to be a subject they could approach from two different directions and end up in the same place. She had read Dickens. She had not read Tennyson, and she said so honestly. And Henry, after a moment of what appeared to be internal debate, got up and brought the book back to the table and read her one of the shorter poems, in a low, even voice, with the lamp between them casting a warm circle of light in the dark kitchen. She sat very still while he read, and when he finished she did not say anything for a moment. "That is better than I expected," she said finally, meaning both the poem and this, though she kept the second half of that to herself. "He is better than he gets credit for," Henry said, which was almost exactly what she had meant. The nights in Wyoming were cold even in late spring, and the silence was profound in a way that would have been unsettling in Missouri, but here, in this house that was slowly becoming familiar, felt like something she could settle into. She went to bed that night thinking about Henry Boone's voice reading poetry in the lamplight, and found herself surprised by how natural it had felt to be sitting across from him like that, as if they had been doing it for years. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that was honest and grounding. Stella ran the house with an efficiency that freed up time she had not expected to have, time she used to learn the ranch more thoroughly, because she was constitutionally incapable of knowing only part of a thing. She asked Caleb to teach her more about the cattle operation, which he did with a gruff patience that she later learned was his version of deep respect. She rode with Henry on his twice-weekly checks of the fence line and the pastures, and turned out to be a better rider than he had anticipated, which pleased her when she saw him notice it. "Clara Webb said you were capable with horses," he said one morning when she had brought a nervous filly to quiet with a steadiness that had impressed the whole yard. "Clara Webb is a woman who understates things," Stella said. Henry laughed, a real laugh, unexpected enough that it seemed to startle even him, and she thought she could probably get used to hearing that sound. There was the matter of Garrett, the neighboring rancher, which came to a head in the third week of June. His name was Roy Garrett, and he was a man of the kind that the West produced in some abundance, convinced of his own rightness in all things, and not above expressing that conviction through property damage and aggressive posturing. He arrived one morning while Henry was out checking on the new foals, with two of his ranch hands behind him, and he made it clear to Stella, who met him at the porch, that he intended to move the fence along the eastern boundary 10 feet to the north, which was not his fence to move. Stella looked at him for a long moment in the manner that people who did not know her sometimes found disconcerting. "Mr. Garrett," she said pleasantly, "I understand you have a disagreement with Mr. Boone about the property line. That is a matter I am sure Mr. Boone would be glad to discuss with you, with the original land survey records on the table, at a time you arrange with him directly. What I am not willing to do is allow you to move any part of this property's fence line without that conversation happening first, because that fence is where it is based on a legal survey conducted in 1874, and I do not believe your opinion of where it ought to be constitutes the same authority." There was a silence. "Who are you?" Garrett said. "The person standing between you and that fence," Stella said, in exactly the same pleasant tone. He left. He came back the next afternoon, when Henry was present, and the conversation that followed was tense and brief, and ended with Henry producing the survey record and Garrett being unable to argue with it in any coherent way. He departed making dark, unspecific comments about things not being over, but Henry had handled men like Garrett before and was not particularly alarmed. "You held your ground yesterday," Henry said, after Garrett's wagon had disappeared down the road. "It needed holding," Stella said. "I am aware." He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading. "Thank you." She nodded and went back inside, and Henry stood on the porch for a moment longer, watching her go, and felt something shift another degree in a direction that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It was Tom who brought things to a head, accidentally and with the best of intentions, as young men with poor timing are inclined to do. It was a July evening, warm and still, and they were all on the porch after dinner, which had become a loose habit of the household, and Tom, emboldened by the pleasant evening and possibly a second biscuit, said to no one in particular that it was nice having a family feeling to the place again. Everyone else on the porch went very carefully still. Tom, realizing approximately half a second too late that he had sailed directly into complicated waters, turned the color of a late summer apple. Henry said nothing. Stella said nothing. Caleb looked at the middle distance with a stoic intensity. Dutch appeared to have become extremely interested in his boots. "I mean," Tom said, with the desperate bravery of someone who knows he cannot unmake what he has done but hopes that clarification might help. "It's a good thing, is what I mean, is all." "Tom," Caleb said, "why don't you go check on that mare?" Tom went with great speed. Stella stood up and said she was going to bring the coffee cups inside, and did, and Henry sat on the porch for another few minutes looking out at the dark pasture, and then he went inside too. He found her in the kitchen washing the cups at the pump, and he stood in the doorway for a moment thinking about 6 weeks of letters and 6 weeks of evenings, and a woman who had held his fence line with nothing but her voice and her absolute certainty, and he thought that Tom, for all his lack of subtlety, was not wrong. "Stella," he said. She turned, and she was looking at him with the direct, steady look that he had come to think of as the most specifically her thing about her, the look that said she was not going to pretend not to know what was happening. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I would like to say something that I am not sure I have a right to say yet." "Say it anyway," she said. He did. He told her that he had not written back asking for something other than a housekeeper because he was lonely in any simple sense, though he was. He told her that it was because he had read her letter and recognized something in it, in the directness and the plainness of it, that made him think this was a person he wanted to know, and that the past 6 weeks had confirmed that in ways he had not anticipated. He told her that he did not want her to feel pressured or obligated by the circumstances, that her position here was hers regardless, that he would rather lose the best conversation he had ever had than have her feel that she owed him anything. He said all of this somewhat haltingly, and without the eloquence of his letters, because some things are harder to say out loud than to put on paper. When he was finished, there was a silence that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable, and then Stella Hadley crossed the kitchen floor, which was not a large kitchen, and looked up at him from a distance of approximately 2 feet and said, "Henry, I have been thinking the exact same things. I have just been waiting for you to catch up." He laughed and she laughed, and he reached up and tucked a strand of hair back behind her ear with a careful, deliberate gentleness, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing they could have said would have been as true as the silence was. They did not rush. That was the thing about both of them, separately and together. They were people who had learned, through different routes, that the best things were worth taking seriously and taking slowly. They spent the rest of July and into August in a kind of extended courtship that happened mostly in the spaces between the work that had to be done, in long conversations on the porch after dark, in shared morning rides along the ridge, where the view went out for 20 miles in 3 directions, in the small, accumulative intimacies of 2 people learning to be in the same space without armor. Henry brought her wildflowers once in late July, a loose bunch of Indian paintbrush and lupin that he had gathered on the morning ride, and presented with the self-consciousness of a man who knew perfectly well that he was doing something romantic, and was going to do it anyway. Stella put them in a jar on the windowsill and said nothing except "thank you," but she was smiling while she said it, and the flowers stayed on the windowsill until they fell apart. She read Tennyson, or at least a fair portion of it, working through the book on evenings when the light lasted long enough, and when she had things to say about it, which she always did, they said them to each other in the lamplight. In August, Roy Garrett came back, this time with a lawyer and a document he claimed superseded the original survey. Henry went to Laramie to consult his own lawyer, a man named Simmons who was small and precise, and had the look of someone who found human folly endlessly unsurprising. Simmons reviewed the documentation. Garrett had produced and identified within an afternoon that it was a forgery, not a sophisticated one. But apparently Garrett had not expected it to be examined by someone competent. The matter was referred to the county sheriff, a solid, unflappable man named Harker who arrested Garrett's hired lawyer and left Garrett himself under a cloud of legal embarrassment from which his reputation in the county did not recover. The fence dispute was over. Henry came back from Laramie on a Wednesday evening and told Stella about it in the kitchen while she was finishing the supper dishes, and she leaned against the sink with her arms crossed and listened to all of it. And when he got to the part about the forgery, she raised her eyebrows and said, "So he was not just mistaken. He was lying." "Apparently so," Henry said. "That is a specific kind of low," she said. "It is." "Well," she said, turning back to the dishes with the air of someone closing a ledger, "then that is dealt with." "That is dealt with," Henry agreed, and he helped her dry the dishes, which was a thing he had started doing in the past few weeks without making a declaration of it, just showing up in the kitchen with a cloth in his hands, and she had made no comment about it either, and somehow this was one of the things she liked best about their arrangement. September in Wyoming arrived with a sharpness in the air that the summer's warmth had been hiding, a reminder that this was a country with teeth, and that the beautiful months were also the preparatory ones. There was a great deal to do before winter, and Stella threw herself into it alongside the men, preserving and storing and winterizing the house, while Henry and Caleb and Dutch worked through the cattle before the early storms. Tom, who had redeemed himself somewhat in Stella's estimation by being genuinely useful when not making social missteps, was put to work stacking wood with an efficiency he had apparently been concealing. It was during this busy, purposeful harvest season push that Henry asked her to marry him. He did not plan it. He had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in his mind the way he turned practical problems over, examining it from every angle, looking for the flaw in the reasoning that would tell him he was moving too fast or thinking wishfully. He could not find the flaw. He found instead, every time he looked at it, that it was the most sensible and the most true thing he had thought in a long time. It happened on a Saturday evening in late September on the porch after supper. The sky was doing something extraordinary to the west, all deep purples and burning golds, the kind of sunset that made you understand why people came out here and stayed even when it was hard. They were sitting in the two porch chairs with their coffee, which was where they always were at this hour, and it had been a good day, the kind of day where the work was hard but everything went the way it was supposed to, and there was a feeling of rightness in the air that Henry decided to trust. He did not kneel, because he was a practical man, and the porch boards were not kind to knees, and he did not have a ring because he had not planned this moment, and he thought she would appreciate honesty over theater. He set his coffee cup down and turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him at almost exactly the same moment, the way they had been doing for months now, as if they were always slightly aware of each other's attention. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "I have gathered that," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said, plainly and directly, which was the only way he knew how to say it and which he was fairly sure was the only way she would want to hear it. Not because it is the practical thing, although it is. Because I cannot think about this life I have here without thinking about you in it now, and I do not want to. Because I think we are good together and I think we will be better, and because I am very much in love with you and I suspect I have been for quite some time. Stella Hadley looked at him for a long moment in the extraordinary September light, and he made himself hold her gaze and not reach for the coffee cup to do something with his hands, and then she said, "I love you too, Henry." "Yes." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and they sat there holding hands watching the sunset finish itself, while the horses moved quietly in the pasture, and the whole big Wyoming world went about its business around them. and Henry Boone thought that this was the best he had felt in longer than he could clearly remember. They were married in the first week of October in Laramie at the small Methodist church on Grant Street, with Clara Webb in attendance, which felt right since Clara had been the cause of everything. Tom was there in his best shirt, which appeared to have been pressed for the occasion with an iron wielded with more enthusiasm than skill. Caleb and Dutch stood at the back of the church with the solid, approving air of men who had decided some time ago that this was how things should go and were gratified to be proven right. The minister, a lean, gray-bearded man named Reverend Aldous, performed the ceremony with dignified briskness, and when he told Henry he could kiss his bride, Henry did, and Stella kissed him back without any ceremony about it. And from the back of the church Tom made a sound that could charitably be described as enthusiasm. The celebration afterward at the Laramie Hotel's dining room was simple but warm, good food and good company. And Clara Webb told anyone who would listen that she had known from the moment she heard about the Double B's vacancy that this was exactly how it would end. A claim that Stella suspected was not entirely accurate, but was happy to allow. They drove back to the ranch in the evening, Henry and Stella, in the wagon with a cold, clear sky overhead and a half-moon riding high over the hills. They were quiet for much of the drive, the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill every silence with reassurance. The ranch was quiet when they arrived. The hands settled in the bunkhouse, and the house was dark except for the lamp Henry had left burning in the kitchen window, which she had asked him to do because she liked the idea of coming back to a light in the window. She looked at the house as they pulled into the yard, this solid, serious, working house with its wide porch and its stone chimney and its lamp burning warmly in the dark, and she felt something that she thought must be what people meant when they talked about home. Not the place you were from, but the place that was made from who you chose to be and who you chose to be with. Henry helped her down from the wagon and left the horse in Dutch's care with a note on the barn door, and they went inside together, and Stella stood in the kitchen she had been running for 5 months and felt it settle around her differently, with a permanence and a belonging that it had been building toward all along. They had the winter to themselves, in the best sense. The Wyoming winter that year came in with a proper force, early snows and hard frosts that drove everything inside and made the ranch house a world of its own for weeks at a time. Stella found, against her expectations, that she did not mind the isolation the way she had sometimes minded the smallness of the rented room in Cheyenne. The smallness of a place changes completely when you are in it with someone you want to be in it with. Henry read to her on winter evenings, not just Tennyson now but other things, and she read to him in return, and they discovered a shared taste for stories with consequence and a shared intolerance for stories that refused to commit to their own meaning. They argued about books sometimes, which they both enjoyed, because they were sufficiently alike to find each other interesting and sufficiently different to find each other challenging. Henry was better at patience. Stella was better at clarity. Together they were better at most things than either of them had been alone. Caleb and Dutch wintered over at the bunkhouse as usual, and Tom went home to his family in Colorado for December and January, which meant the ranch was quieter than it would become in the spring, and there was something pleasant about the particular smallness of it. The horses in the barn needed tending through the cold months, and Henry was deep in the planning stages of the breeding operation he had been developing, and Stella got involved in the planning in a way that surprised him initially and then stopped surprising him, because she was sharp about numbers and practical about logistics and had opinions that were worth having. By February, she knew she was pregnant. She waited 2 weeks before she told Henry, not out of hesitation but because she wanted to be certain, and also because she was, privately, finding her own way through a complicated mixture of feelings. Happiness, undeniably, a kind of awe, and beneath both, a careful, vigilant hope of the sort that comes with understanding that good things can be fragile. She told him on a Sunday morning in February, before he went out to the barn, while they were having coffee at the kitchen table. She said it plainly, the way she said most important things, looking at him over the rim of her cup with the steady directness that he had loved from the first letter she sent him. Henry put his coffee cup down and looked at her, and she watched the information settle through him. And then he reached across the table and took both of her hands in his and held them, and the look on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Are you well?" he said, which was such a Henry thing to say, practical and caring in the same breath, that she felt something in her chest expand too suddenly. "I am very well," she said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her very carefully, the way you hold something that is both sturdy and precious, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel, for a moment, the full, unfiltered weight of happiness that she had been keeping measured and careful. "A boy," he said quietly against her hair. "You cannot know that," she said. "No," he agreed, "I cannot, but I would like one if that is something the world is willing to do." "We will see what the world is willing to do," she said. Spring came back to Wyoming like a reprieve, which is what spring always is in those latitudes, and the ranch went from the careful hibernation of winter to the full-throttle urgency of the working season practically overnight. The first foals were born in April from the breeding pairs Henry had so carefully arranged, and they were everything he had hoped for, well-built and clean-limbed. And Stella stood at the paddock fence with him. The morning, the first one took its initial tentative steps on legs that looked engineered for something longer than they currently were, and she reached over and took his hand without looking away from the foal, and he held her hand without looking away from the foal. And they stood there like that while the new animal figured out the world. Tom came back from Colorado in March with a girl on his arm, or at least a girl who had agreed to correspond with him from Colorado, which amounted to nearly the same thing, and the improvement in his general demeanor was significant. He worked harder, complained less, and appeared to be attempting a level of personal grooming that he had not previously considered necessary. Henry and Stella pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing they could do. Caleb, who was the most observant of the three hands and the most private about his own affairs, mentioned one April evening that he had heard there was a ranch for sale further up the valley, a smaller operation, and that he had been thinking about it. Henry and Stella received this information with the gravity it deserved, because Caleb had been with the Double B for 8 years, and losing him would be a real loss, and because they both recognized that a man who was beginning to think about land of his own was a man who was ready for the next thing and deserved to go toward it. Over the following weeks, Henry helped Caleb look into the ranch in question, went with him to inspect it, helped him understand the financing, and was thoroughly decent about the whole thing in a way that Caleb, who had been prepared for a more difficult conversation, clearly had not fully anticipated. Stella organized a farewell supper that Caleb received with the stoic gratitude of a man who is deeply moved, but has not equipped himself with the vocabulary for it. He left in June, with Henry's blessing, and a horse Henry said was in partial payment for years of service that had never been adequately compensated. Caleb put his hat on and rode out of the Double B yard with the air of a man heading toward something rather than away from it, which is the best kind of leaving. They hired a new hand in July, a quiet, competent man of about 30 named Reeves, who had come up from Texas and had the specific, unhurried competence of someone who had been working cattle since he could walk. He fit into the rhythms of the ranch without disruption, and Dutch, who was conservative about new people, approved of him within a week, which was a recommendation worth having. Stella's pregnancy progressed through the summer with a straightforward stubbornness that matched her general approach to most things. She was not, as she told Henry on several occasions, made of glass, and she was not going to be treated as though she were. She scaled back certain physical activities as the summer went on, not because she was told to, but because she was sensible, and she stayed close to the house in August when it became clear that things were getting closer than comfortable for a long horse ride. She also made Henry promise, twice, that when the time came he would ride for the midwife in Laramie, a woman named Mrs. Greaves who had a solid reputation in the county, and not attempt to manage the proceedings himself, no matter how practical he thought he was. He promised and kept the promise. The baby was born on the 23rd of September, 1883, 1 year and a few weeks after their wedding, in the upstairs bedroom of the Double B Ranch house, with Mrs. Greaves in attendance and Henry in the hallway, demonstrating the particular agony of a man who very much wants to be helpful and has been firmly told to wait. The labor was not easy, but Stella was not a woman who accepted defeat from anything if she could help it, and Mrs. Greaves said afterward that she was the most composed first-time mother she had attended in 20 years, which was high praise from a woman who did not distribute compliments casually. It was a boy. Exactly as Henry had hoped, though he would not have been anything but grateful for a girl. Henry was allowed into the room about an hour after the birth, and he came in slowly, as if afraid that something in the room was breakable, and Stella looked up at him from the bed where she was propped against 3 pillows, with the kind of profound, exhausted peace of someone who has just done an enormous thing, and in her arms was a small, faintly furious-looking person, who appeared to have decided that existing was an inconvenience, and was not shy about expressing it. Henry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them for a long moment, and his face did the thing it had done when she told him she was pregnant, the unguarded thing, and he reached out and very carefully touched the baby's cheek, and the small furious person stopped being furious for approximately 3 seconds, which was apparently enough. "James," Stella said quietly, which was the name they had agreed on for her first husband who had been a good man and deserved to be remembered well. "James," Henry repeated, with the care of a man holding something sacred. They named him James Henry Boone, and he was, from the beginning, an outspoken individual with strong opinions about feeding times, and a temperament that mixed his mother's directness with his father's stubbornness, in a combination that suggested he would be someone's problem and someone's joy in more or less equal measure for decades to come. Life on the Double B entered a new phase after James's arrival, denser and louder and more full in ways that Henry, who had spent so many years in the companionable quiet of a ranch and had thought himself content with it, had not known he was missing. Stella managed the baby and the house and her ongoing involvement in the ranch's operations with a capacity for organization that impressed even herself on good days and exhausted her on difficult ones. And Henry learned, in the way that men learn best when they have no choice about it, that being a father meant participating rather than observing, and threw himself into it with the same commitment he gave to everything he cared about. He was good at it. That surprised him. He was patient with small things, and good at reading what was actually wrong when a baby was communicating through the limited vocabulary available to a baby, which turned out to be a skill not unlike reading weather patterns or the behavior of horses, a matter of paying genuine attention rather than projecting what you expected to see. Stella watched him with James and thought, not for the first time, that the truest things about a person were visible when they were off their guard, and Henry Boone off his guard was a man of considerably more depth than even his letters had suggested, which was saying a great deal. Tom, who was still with the ranch in the spring of 1884, received a visit from his Colorado correspondent in March, a young woman named Ada, who was 21, and had a determined friendliness that made everyone in the house feel immediately comfortable, and who appeared to find Tom genuinely wonderful, which everyone else on the property found simultaneously baffling and deeply satisfying. Ada came for what was supposed to be 2 weeks, and she and Stella got along immediately, in the way of 2 women who recognize in each other a fundamental practicality dressed in different clothes, and by the end of the first week, Ada had decided that Wyoming suited her better than Colorado, and by the end of the second week, it was clear she was not going back. Tom proposed to Ada in the yard one Sunday morning in a manner that Stella observed from the kitchen window, without being able to hear the words, but was perfectly able to read from Ada's expression, which went from surprise to tears to emphatic nodding in about 30 seconds. Stella turned back to the stove feeling very satisfied with how things were arranging themselves. Ada and Tom were married in June 1884, a small wedding in Laramie, and Henry and Stella stood up as witnesses, and afterward everyone had a picnic by the river because it was a beautiful June day and nobody wanted to be inside. James, who was 9 months old at the time, spent the afternoon being passed around by various adults who found him agreeable company, despite his forthright opinions about being put down. Caleb sent a letter from his ranch, which was doing well, and included a small gift for the newlyweds, a careful selection of vegetable seeds from his own winter stock, which was an enormously Caleb kind of gift, and made everyone who heard about it smile. Dutch, who had shown no signs of any personal life developments whatsoever, but who was rock solid and utterly reliable, and had by now been with the Double B for 9 years, was given a significant raise in the summer of 1884 because Henry felt strongly that loyalty ought to be compensated, and that he had waited too long to act on that feeling. Dutch received the news with his characteristic solemnity and said only, "Appreciate it, boss," and went back to what he was doing, and Henry thought that there was something deeply right about knowing who you could count on. The horse breeding operation came fully into its own that year. The first crop of well-bred stock had been sold in the spring, and had commanded prices that justified every calculation Henry had made, and the reputation of the Double B's breeding program had begun to spread in the quiet, word-of-mouth way that the best reputations spread. By autumn, Henry had orders for the following year's foals from 3 different buyers, including one from Colorado and one from as far as Denver, and the operation that had been a plan on paper was now a functioning second revenue source that was beginning to approach the cattle income in significance. Stella had been involved in the accounting from the beginning, keeping the books with a precision that had exposed, in the first year, 2 invoicing errors in the ranch's favor and 1 significant error in the feed supplier's favor that had been costing the Double B money for the better part of 3 years. Recovering that overpayment had been a source of quiet satisfaction that she brought up occasionally, not boastfully, just with the particular pleasure of a person who has identified a wrong and made it right. In the winter of 1884, while James was learning to navigate the ranch house on legs that were also still figuring out their basic function, Stella began to understand that she was pregnant again. She told Henry in the same way she had told him the first time, over coffee at the kitchen table, plainly and directly. He looked at her with an expression that was now recognizable in all its dimensions, the practical concern and the deep happiness and the warmth that he had mostly stopped trying to contain. "Are you well?" he said in exactly the same tone as before. "I am very well," she said, smiling because it was the same exchange and it was right that it was. "A girl this time," he said, which was, she suspected, what he had been privately hoping for since James arrived. "You still cannot know that," she said. "No," he said, "but the world owes me some flexibility on the matter." The world, as it turned out, was willing to be flexible. Their daughter was born in August 1885, on a warm summer morning with the windows open and the sound of the horses in the south pasture coming in on the breeze, and she arrived into the world with considerably less drama than her brother, as if she had decided that efficiency was a virtue worth establishing from the beginning. They named her Clara, for Clara Webb, who cried when she heard the news and wrote a letter so full of feeling that Stella had to fold it away quickly before she started as well. Clara Boone was, from her earliest days, a different creature from her brother. Where James announced himself constantly, Clara watched, She watched everything, with large, dark eyes that she had inherited from Stella, and that held the same quality of seeing more than she was letting on. And she had the patience of someone who understood that the best moment to act was not the first one available. Henry adored both of his children with the uncomplicated fullness of a man who had not known he had that much love available until it was called upon. He was methodically good with James, who needed managing and channeling and a great deal of patient redirection. And he was quietly enchanted by Clara, who had discovered within the first year that if she simply held up her arms to him, he would stop whatever he was doing and pick her up, a discovery she deployed with the tactical precision of a military campaign. Stella watched Henry with the children and thought, often, about the letter she had written to a stranger in Wyoming asking for work, and about the letter she had received back asking for something else entirely, and about how the world hinges sometimes on a decision made in a rented room above a laundry with nothing but honesty to recommend it. She wrote to Clara Webb about this, once in the winter of 1886, a long letter that she sent from the writing desk under the south pasture window, the one that had been in her room since she arrived. She wrote about how it felt to be in a life that fit. Not a perfect life, because the winters were genuinely hard and the work was unrelenting, and there were days when everything went wrong simultaneously, and the ranch demanded more than either of them had left to give. But a life that was true, in the sense that mattered, built from real choices made by real people who knew what they were choosing and had chosen honestly. Clara Webb wrote back at length, full of news about Cheyenne, and ended the letter by saying that she was enormously pleased with herself for suggesting the arrangement and intended to take credit for it indefinitely, which made Stella laugh out loud in the empty kitchen in a way that made Henry appear in the doorway from the other room to investigate. "Clara Webb," Stella said by way of explanation. "What has she done now?" Henry said. "She is taking credit for us," Stella said. Henry considered this. "She has some grounds for it," he said. "A little," Stella allowed. The summer of 1887 brought a new challenge to the Double B, of the kind that the West in this period produced with unnerving regularity. A drought settled over the central Wyoming basin in June, the kind that turned the grass yellow by July and made the water levels in every creek drop to a trickle, and the cattle ranchers of the region were forced into the uncomfortable calculus of how many animals they could sustain against declining water and feed. Henry had the advantage of having worked the south pasture well for years, and of having drilled a second well the previous autumn on Stella's practical insistence, which meant the Double B was better positioned than many of their neighbors. Roy Garrett, whose property had never fully recovered from the legal embarrassment of 1882, was in a much worse position. Henry heard in town that Garrett was struggling badly, and he spent an evening thinking about what a better man would do and what he wanted to do, and decided that these were the same thing, and rode over to Garrett's property the following morning. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, he said only that he had offered Garrett access to the Double B's second well for his cattle, through a specific gate in the eastern fence, for the duration of the drought, in exchange for Garrett signing a formal acknowledgement of the correct fence line, which Garrett had agreed to. Stella listened to this and thought about who this man was and how rare it was, this combination of toughness and decency, and she said simply, that was the right thing to do. He needed water, Henry said, with the slight discomfort of a man who did not want to be praised for being decent. His cattle did not do anything to anyone. The drought broke in September, and the agreement with Garrett held, and the fence issue never resurfaced. Garrett was not a transformed man by any means, but he was a man who had been treated fairly when he did not deserve it, and the effect of that over time was to make him considerably less of a problem. Tom and Ada welcomed a daughter of their own in the spring of 1887, which meant that James and this new baby, who was named Ruby, were of an age that would eventually make them playmates, and the Double B yard in the summers to come had a companionable noise about it that nobody who had known it in its solitary years would have recognized. Dutch, still present, still solid, still apparently content with a life structured entirely around the ranch and the horses, and an untroubled bachelorhood, developed in this period an unexpectedly warm relationship with both Boone children, particularly James, who had figured out that Dutch was an inexhaustible source of horse-related knowledge and practical ranch skills if approached with the right questions. Dutch taught James to rope when he was 4 years old, and regarded the child's early attempts with the grave respect one might give a promising apprentice. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was one of the hardest that Wyoming saw in that decade, part of a pattern of brutal cold and heavy snowfall that affected ranchers across the territory. The Double B lost a portion of its cattle herd in the January storms, not as badly as some, but enough to register as a real financial blow, and there were weeks in February when the roads were impassable and the ranch was entirely self-contained, just Henry and Stella and the children and Dutch and Reeves and the animals, enclosed in the white silence of a Wyoming winter at its most serious. These weeks were, paradoxically, some of the best Henry could remember. There was something clarifying about necessity. The work was essential and the company was genuine, and in the evenings, with the storm pressing against the house and the fire going, there was nowhere else you needed to be and nothing else you needed to be thinking about, and that particular freedom from elsewhere was something he had not expected to find in limitation. Stella read to the children on those evenings, and Henry listened from the other chair, and sometimes Clara would fall asleep against Stella's side, and James would fall asleep on the rug near the fire, and Henry and Stella would sit in the quiet after they carried the children up to bed and talk in low voices about the ranch and the spring, and what they would do differently next year, and what they wanted for the next 10 years, and what they hoped the children would become. And these conversations had the texture of something being built, the ongoing work of two people who had chosen each other, and kept choosing each other in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that accumulated into life. The spring of 1888 brought recovery and renewal, as Wyoming springs always did, with a defiant abundance of grass and wildflowers that made the bleakness of the previous months feel like a necessary passage rather than an interruption. The surviving cattle flourished in the new growth, and the horse breeding program produced what Henry privately considered his best year of foals yet, including a gray colt that he named Boone's Folly for reasons that were sentimental, and that he did not fully explain to anyone, though Stella knew. Boone's Folly turned out to be the finest horse the Double B had ever produced. He was sold in the autumn to a buyer from Denver for a price that Henry calculated, with the slightly stunned expression of a man who was good at numbers but had not expected this particular number, represented more than 3 months of the cattle operation's typical income. The buyer, a man named Harrington, shook Henry's hand with the seriousness of someone who knew he was getting something exceptional and wanted the seller to know that he knew it. "You have a gift for this," Harrington said, gesturing at the paddock in general. "Good horses start with good decisions years before they're born," Henry said. "Most of those decisions were my wife's." Harrington looked at Stella, who was standing at the fence with Clara on her hip, with revised appreciation. Stella received his look with equanimity and said nothing, because she was accustomed to that particular moment, the moment when men recalibrated their understanding of who was responsible for what, and she found that the recalibration, when it came, was entirely sufficient reward. In the autumn of 1888, Stella discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. James was 5 now, old enough to be aware that something was happening without being fully clear on the nature of the development, and Clara was 3 and characteristically observed everything with her steady dark eyes and said very little about any of it. The 3rd pregnancy was harder than the first 2. Stella was 32, which was not old by any reasonable measure, but was not young in the terms that the body uses for these reckonings, and the winter was again challenging, and she was tired in a way she had not been tired before in a sustained, cellular way that she managed by continuing to do most of what she always did, but at a slightly reduced pace that she would not have admitted to if Henry had not been paying close enough attention to notice, and to take over without making it into something she needed to explain. He was extraordinary during those months. He managed the house alongside the ranch without drawing attention to the managing, cooking meals that were not as accomplished as hers, but were made with a care that made up for the technical shortcomings. He kept James occupied with ranch work and horse education and reading sessions that the boy endured with varying degrees of patience. He read to Stella on the evenings when she was too tired to hold a book, working through a novel she had been wanting to reach for months, his voice steady and unhurried in the lamplight while she lay on the settle with Clara curled against her legs. She told him once in February of that last long winter pregnancy that she had not imagined this when she wrote that first letter, not the difficulty, but the way the difficulty was held by something that made it manageable. "What did you imagine?" he asked. "Something practical," she said, "something functional, a fair employer and honest work and enough money to not be frightened of the future." And instead, she looked at him across the lamplight. "This," she said, which encompassed the room and the children sleeping upstairs and the ranch outside the window and the years of letters and evenings and arguments about books and the specific way he held her hands when she needed him to, and the fact that he had read half a novel to her this winter and would finish it without being asked. All of this. Henry reached across and tucked the quilt more firmly around her feet, which were always cold in winter, and which he had been managing in this manner for years without making a production of it, and he said quietly, "I will take all of this over anything I could have thought to ask for." The baby came in April of 1889 in the spring, which felt entirely appropriate. It was a boy, a solid and vigorous one who arrived with the announcement of someone who intended to be heard and did not plan to apologize for it. They named him Robert, for Henry's father's middle name, which had never quite had the full recognition it deserved, and from his first week Robert demonstrated that James's legacy of strong opinions was in safe hands. Stella recovered well and thoroughly, in the manner of someone who has dealt with a serious thing, and is ready to move past it without excessive reflection. By May she was back in the garden she had established in the 3rd year of their marriage, a productive kitchen garden that had expanded over the seasons to include medicinal herbs and cutting flowers alongside the vegetables, because she had decided that beautiful things were a legitimate use of good soil, and she did not intend to argue the point with anyone. The Double B in the summer of 1889 was a different animal from the ranch Henry had been running alone in 1882. It had grown, not just in size and income, but in the fullness of a place that is lived in by people who mean to be there. The main house had been expanded by a room in 1886, a real parlor on the south side, where the afternoon light came in and where there were curtains that Stella had made from fabric ordered from the catalog, and a braided rug from a widow in town who made them beautifully. There were pictures on the walls, photographs, and a small painting of the mountains that a passing artist had done in exchange for a week's meals and lodging. There was a shelf in the parlor dedicated entirely to children's books, which were read until their spines gave up entirely. James at 6 was deeply invested in the horses, had inherited his mother's directness and his father's patience in roughly equal measure, and was already useful in the barn in a supervised capacity that Dutch oversaw with the quiet pride of someone who has found an excellent student. Clara at 4 watched everything and was beginning to ask questions that were several years ahead of schedule. Robert at several months was making his presence known, with the enthusiasm of a person who had not yet learned that there was anyone else in the room. Ada and Tom were well established in their portion of ranch life, with Ruby nearly 2 and another baby coming in the autumn, And the yard of the Double B had the populated, purposeful warmth of a place where something was genuinely happening. Henry stood on the porch on a Sunday morning in July of 1889, the summer heat already building by 8 o'clock, and looked out at the south pasture where 6 of this year's foals were moving in the early light, and at the mountain ridge beyond the pasture going blue in the distance, and at the yard where Dutch was beginning the morning's work with his characteristic unhurried competence. And he thought about what he had had before Stella's letter arrived and what he had now. Before, he had had a working ranch and good land, and a life that was productive and solitary. He had not known how solitary it actually was until it stopped being solitary, which is how loneliness usually works. The letters had begun it, those honest, careful, gradually less careful letters back and forth across Wyoming in the spring of 1882. A woman in a rented room asking for work, and a man who had written back asking for something else entirely, something neither of them had named but both of them had understood. Stella came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee, the way she did on the mornings when Robert had not been up at an unreasonable hour, and she handed Henry his cup and stood beside him looking out at the same view. "Dutch is starting on the east fence today," she said. "He told me last night," Henry said. "The gray filly is looking sound," she said. "I think she is ready to start in earnest." "Reeves agrees," Henry said. "We were thinking Wednesday." She nodded, and they stood with their coffee in the July morning, and after a moment Henry put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned very slightly into his side, and they stood like that while the ranch began its day around them. "I was thinking," Stella said after a while. "About what?" "About whether we ought to expand the lower pasture next spring. There is land along the creek that Harrington mentioned when he was here last autumn, a section that the previous owner let go fallow. If it came available, it would be worth considering." Henry looked at her sideways with the expression that meant he was trying not to smile. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know you were," she said. "I was waiting to see how long before you brought it up, and instead you brought it up yourself." "One of us had to," she said, and the warmth in her voice was the particular warmth of a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly who she is standing next to and has decided, repeatedly and without reservation, that this is the right place and the right person, and intends to go on deciding it for as long as the world allows. The years rolled forward in the way that good years do, with the seasons marking them and the work sustaining them, and the children growing through them in the inevitable, astonishing way of children who are loved and given room to become who they are. James grew tall and capable, spending his summers in the barn and his winters in determined resistance to school that Henry managed with the particular combination of firmness and respect that the boy responded to. Clara grew into a child who read everything she could find and asked questions that required thought to answer, and Henry answered them thoughtfully and Stella answered them directly, and between the 2 approaches she was well served. Robert was a generous, loud, cheerful child who resembled Henry in his bone structure and Stella in his absolute certainty that he was correct about most things. Clara Webb visited the ranch in the autumn of 1890, making the trip from Cheyenne with the energy of a woman who has been intending to make a journey for years and has finally decided to stop intending and start doing. She was a small, bright-eyed woman in her 50s with an enormous opinion about everything and an enormous heart to back it up, and she sat on the Double B porch on her second evening there, with a cup of coffee and Henry and Stella on either side of her, and looked out at the yard where the 3 children were in various stages of evening activity, and she said, with a satisfaction that encompassed the entire view, "I knew it." "You knew nothing," Stella said fondly. "I knew enough," Clara said. "I knew that rancher needed a capable woman, and I knew you needed somewhere worthy of you. The rest I left to common sense and the postal service." "And Tennyson," Henry said, so quietly that it was nearly just to himself. Stella looked at him and Clara looked at him, and he looked at the middle distance with the slight color of a man who had not intended to say that out loud. And then Stella started laughing and Clara joined in, and Henry held out approximately 10 seconds before he joined them too. And the sound of it went out into the warm autumn evening and disappeared into the big Wyoming sky. The Postal Service, and common sense, and perhaps a small and decisive contribution from Alfred Lord Tennyson, had done well by all three of them. The letters that had started it, those 7 or 8 weeks of careful, honest correspondence between a woman asking for work and a man asking for something else entirely, had built this. Not just the ranch and the prosperity and the well-bred horses in the south pasture, but the fact of two people who had looked at each other through the medium of pen and paper and recognized something true, and then had the good sense and the courage to follow it out of the letter and into the living. Stella Hadley, who had become Stella Boone in the autumn of 1882 in a small Methodist church in Laramie, had arrived in Wyoming with a trunk, a travel bag, a complete absence of sentimentality, and a capacity for love that she had not yet been given sufficient reason to deploy at its full extent. She had found that reason in a ranch house with a lamp in the window and a man who read poetry and held fence lines through honest conversation, and taught her what it meant to be seen clearly and loved precisely for what was seen. Henry Boone had written back to a letter asking for work and asked, carefully and honestly, for something else entirely, and the something else had been everything. On an October morning in 1890, with the aspens on the ridge gone gold and the air carrying the first real edge of the coming winter, Henry saddled 2 horses while Stella finished packing the lunch, and they rode out together on the long loop around the property that they had taken on weekend mornings since the early years of their marriage when it was possible to take them. The children were in Dutch and Ada's capable care. The ranch was operating with the settled efficiency of a place that knew what it was doing. The sky was the specific blue of a Wyoming October that exists nowhere else on Earth. They rode side by side along the ridge where the view opened out to the full 20-mile panorama, and they stopped there for a while, their horses standing quietly in the morning sun. "The creek section is available," Henry said. "Simmons sent word yesterday." "I know," Stella said. "He sent me word too." Henry looked at her. She looked back at him with her direct, dark-eyed gaze and the slight smile that was one of the things he loved most about her face. "Shall we buy it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "We shall." They rode on along the ridge, with the mountains to the west and the plains to the east and the whole enormous, beautiful, demanding, rewarding territory of their life stretching out in every direction. And the Double B Ranch below them looked, from this height, like exactly what it was: a home, a going concern, a thing built by 2 people who had found each other through the improbable and perfect medium of an honest letter, and had made from that beginning something that was meant to last. And it did last. It lasted through more winters and more springs, through children growing and leaving and coming back, through losses that were genuine and gains that were earned, through all the ordinary and extraordinary days that are what a life is actually made of when you look at it clearly. It lasted in the way that things last when they are built on a true foundation, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the specific durability of 2 people who keep choosing each other and keep meaning it. The Double B Ranch stood, and the Boone family stood with it, and on the porch in the evenings the lamp burned in the window the way Stella had asked for it to burn on the very first night she came home, and it was a light that was visible from a long way off, a warm point in the dark Wyoming night, the kind of light that tells you something real is happening inside, and that you are welcome to come toward it if you are the right person. And that if you are the right person you will know it by the way it calls to you across the distance. Henry Boone had known it from the first letter. Stella Hadley had known it from the second. And everything that followed, all of it, every ordinary morning and extraordinary evening and difficult winter and beautiful spring, had been the 2 of them walking toward that light together, which was all it had ever needed to be.